The morning arrived with a sound of wings that no one had anticipated. In the quiet dawn of Sunday, December 7th, 1941, the Pacific Ocean stretched out, forgiving and silver blue. Palm trees rustled in a light breeze, and the bells of nearby churches were poised to ring. At Pearl Harbor, sailors were still shaking off sleep, their world not yet torn apart. The battleships anchored in the harbor appeared more like monuments than weapons of war, immense, self-assured, and tranquil. Few could have guessed that those steel hulls would soon burn like pyres against the sky. High above, Japanese pilots guided their aircraft into formation. They had drilled for this moment in utmost secrecy, practicing on isolated airfields across Japan, memorizing every angle of their approach. From the cockpit of his Zero, one pilot would later remember the thunder of their engines felt like mechanical certainty. It seemed as though they bore the very destiny of an empire on their wings. They were convinced America's own wings were brittle, that a single, decisive strike would break them. At 7:55 in the morning, the fragile illusion of peace shattered. Dive bombers screamed down from the clouds like hawks descending on their prey. The first explosions ripped through the calm morning air, sending towers of flame reaching for the sky. Black smoke billowed, transforming the harbor into a boiling cauldron. A sailor aboard the USS Arizona later wrote that it felt as if the world had cracked open in a single moment. Metal shrieked, men screamed, and the sea itself seemed to boil with fire. The Japanese had selected the hour with cold, deliberate calculation. On that Sunday morning, a great number of sailors were either ashore or still asleep in their bunks. The battleships were aligned in battleship row like offerings awaiting a sacrifice. Bombs struck their targets with terrifying precision. The forward magazine of the Arizona erupted in a blast so immense it lifted the colossal ship from the water. In mere seconds, over 1,000 men were lost, their last cries consumed by the inferno. Chaos reigned everywhere. Sirens wailed across the harbor. Anti-aircraft gunners, some barefoot and still in their pajamas or undershirts, scrambled to their stations. With hands that shook, they loaded their guns and fired into a sky thick with smoke and moving shadows. The stench of burning oil filled the air so completely that men would later swear they could taste it for days. Across the water, the USS Oklahoma listed and then rolled onto her side, trapping hundreds of sailors below deck. One witness remembered hearing the sound of fists pounding on steel from within, like desperate knocks on a coffin lid. Above the carnage, Japanese pilots wheeled and roared through the sky. Some would later describe the feeling as exhilarating, while others found it surreal. The targets were enormous and undefended. It was like striking a sleeping giant, one of them remarked. In Tokyo, the planners were certain this attack would cripple America for years to come. Admiral Yamamoto himself had voiced caution about waking a sleeping giant, but few in his circle believed that giant would stir so quickly. On the ground, soldiers and sailors felt not like giants, but like ants caught in a violent storm. Bombs rained down on the runways, shattering American aircraft that were neatly lined up, wingtip to wingtip. Fire engulfed the hangars. Airmen sprinted toward their planes, only to be cut down by gunfire before their engines could even turn over. In those initial 30 minutes, the air power of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was seemingly erased. To the Japanese pilots, the sky above looked as if it belonged to them alone. For the civilians in Honolulu, the attack was a horrifying intrusion into their world. Mothers held their children close as the sky growled with an alien thunder. Some initially mistook the columns of smoke for a volcanic eruption, until fragments of hot steel began to rain down on their streets. Churches that were preparing for morning hymns were instead filled with screams. Housewives crouched in their kitchens, listening to the chilling rattle of machine gun fire from above. One school teacher later said, "The sky turned so black with smoke, it felt as if the sun had vanished." At Pearl Harbor, the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Men dove into the water to escape the burning decks, only to find the harbor itself was a sea of flame, covered in burning oil slicks. Fire skated across the surface, trapping the wounded between drowning and being burned alive. Some swam through literal walls of fire, their skin blistering in the heat. Others clung to floating debris, their eyes wide with disbelief. The assault came in 2 waves, involving 353 Japanese aircraft in total. By the time the second wave retreated, a profound silence fell over the harbor, punctuated only by the crackle of flames and the groaning of twisted metal. The harbor had been turned into a graveyard. Battleships lay capsized or smoldering. Aircraft were crumpled heaps, their wings folded like those of broken birds. The toll was staggering. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, and nearly 1,200 were wounded. 19 ships were either damaged or completely destroyed. Hundreds of planes were reduced to charred skeletons. The Japanese pilots returned to their carriers in a state of jubilation. They had anticipated strong resistance, perhaps even heavy losses. Instead, they had found the sky was theirs to command. One pilot recalled that it had almost been too easy. In their minds, America had been broken in a single morning. The Pacific, they believed, was now theirs to rule. But amid the wreckage, a different narrative was already beginning to form. Survivors pulled their comrades from the water, their faces masked by soot and oil. Doctors turned mess halls into makeshift hospitals. Sailors with severe burns, wrapped in bandages, went back to help load ammunition. One officer would later write, "We were bloodied, yes, but we were not bowed." The smoke that hung over Pearl Harbor may have looked like defeat, but smoldering within it was something the Japanese had not factored into their calculations. Resolve. President Franklin Roosevelt, briefed within hours, would frame the event in words that would echo throughout history, calling it a date which will live in infamy. His speech, broadcast the next day, carried not only a tremor of outrage, but also one of steadfast determination. For every American who listened, from farmhouses in Kansas to factories in Detroit, the message was unmistakable. This was not an end, but a summons to action. Still, in the stunned haze of that first day, the future remained deeply uncertain. The battleships of the Pacific Fleet were gutted. The airfields were blackened ruins. To many, it appeared that the Japanese were right, that America's wings had indeed been broken. Newspaper headlines screamed the news in ink as dark as the smoke still drifting over Hawaii. "Fleet crippled," one declared. "War declared," another followed. Across the nation, families braced for the worst. Would Japan now sweep across the Pacific without challenge? Would America be left a wounded colossus, bleeding out in its own waters? Yet, beneath the despair, the first stirrings of defiance could already be felt. Volunteers began to line up at recruitment stations. Longshoremen talked of working double shifts. A factory worker in Seattle was reported to have told his foreman, "If they think they clipped our wings, they have no idea what's coming." A transformation had begun, though it was still invisible to those staring at the ruins of Pearl Harbor. Back in Tokyo, Japanese leaders toasted their victory. They imagined they had months, perhaps even years, before America could possibly recover. They envisioned negotiating peace on their own terms, with an empire stretching unopposed across the Pacific. They did not hear the chorus of voices rising in the streets of America. They did not see the factories that were about to roar to life. They had underestimated not just a military, but a culture of resilience. In the harbor, the sun finally set on that terrible day. Fires continued to burn. Smoke drifted in low clouds, turning the twilight into an almost unearthly scene. Survivors staggered across the decks, coughing, weeping, or moving in stunned silence. Chaplains read last rites over the bodies that had been lined up on the shore. The air was thick with the smell of oil and sorrow. For many, it felt like the end of something vast and unshakable. And yet, even as darkness fell, a single truth lingered in the embers. America was wounded, but it was not destroyed. In the words of one sailor, scribbled in a letter home, "We'll rise from this. I don't know how, but we will." The Japanese pilots had flown away believing they had broken a giant's wings. What they could not see was that in factories far across the ocean, those wings were already being reforged in steel and fire. What would rise from the smoke of Pearl Harbor would not be silence or surrender, but the thunder of thousands of bombers yet to be born. And when those wings finally filled the sky, the pilots who once thought America was crippled would look up and understand just how wrong they had been. The embers of Pearl Harbor had scarcely cooled when another kind of fire began to stir, one not lit by bombs, but by human will. Across the American continent, the shock of December 7th ignited an energy no enemy could have calculated. The attack had left battleships gutted and airfields charred, but it had also carved a wound into the national psyche, a wound that bled not despair, but determination. From farmhands in Iowa to machinists in California, the question was no longer if America would respond, but how and how quickly. The answer began with a machine that had once been doubted, almost dismissed. In the mid-1930s, when Boeing's engineers first rolled out their prototype, the Model 299, newspapers gasped at its size and strength. 4 engines, sleek lines, and a bristling frame of defensive gun positions gave it a silhouette unlike anything seen before. Reporters dubbed it the Flying Fortress, but military officials hesitated. It was too big, too expensive, too bold for a peacetime Air Force that still thought of bombers as fragile birds rather than iron citadels. The Model 299 even crashed during a demonstration, killing 2 crewmen, its future hanging by a thread. The Army Air Corps, however, quietly ordered a handful, believing in its potential. Few at the time guessed that this ungainly giant would one day become the backbone of a nation's skyward vengeance. After Pearl Harbor, hesitation vanished like smoke in the wind. The blueprint for the B-17 was no longer just an engineering curiosity. It was destiny. President Franklin Roosevelt's voice, carried on radio waves, galvanized the nation. "We shall build the defense of America into the arsenal of democracy. His call for 50,000 planes a year seemed almost absurd on paper. No country had ever built aircraft in such staggering numbers. Factories that once rolled out cars or refrigerators were asked to turn their rivet guns and conveyor belts toward wings and engines. In Detroit, Henry Ford's Willow Run plant sprawled across acres of farmland like a city unto itself, promising to roll a bomber off the line every hour. In Seattle, Boeing expanded its facilities so rapidly that entire neighborhoods shifted to accommodate the influx of workers. The hum of industry began to echo louder than the roar of bombs. Inside these cavernous plants, the war had a face not of generals, but of ordinary men and women. They arrived with lunch pails and toolkits, with hands calloused from farm fields or soft from office desks. Women in bandanas tightened bolts. Riveters struck sparks against steel frames. Machinists measured tolerances down to a hair's breadth. The air was filled with the clang of hammers, the hiss of welders, and the endless rhythm of assembly lines that stretched as far as the eye could see. Shift whistles blew morning, noon, and night, for the work never stopped. America had turned its grief into motion. There was poetry in the details. A grandmother in Ohio writing letters to her grandson overseas while drilling holes into a bomber's fuselage. Teenagers in overalls learning the art of riveting from foremen who once built passenger planes. Entire families uprooted to work in plants where dormitories rose almost overnight. A single bomber required over 13,000 parts, each one an echo of 1,000 hands. To walk through those factories was to see the war transfigured into human energy, sweat gleaming on brows, eyes burning with determination. Statistics tell one part of the story. Production soared from a few dozen B-17s before the war to hundreds each month. By 1943, Willow Run alone produced nearly 500 bombers a month. But numbers cannot capture the heartbeat inside those walls. One woman riveter recalled, "Every time I drove a rivet, I imagined my brother flying that plane. If it held, he held for her. The war was not abstract. It was personal, hammered into every plate of aluminum. And there was humor, too, tucked into the grind. Workers joked that bombers rolled off the line like sausages, though each was the size of a house and weighed over 30 tons. They painted cartoons on assembly jigs, gave nicknames to machines, and pinned snapshots of loved ones to their lockers. In between shifts, they danced to swing records, smoked cigarettes under the glow of factory lamps, and laughed in defiance of fatigue. It was a kind of resilience as vital as steel. Yet behind the energy lay an undercurrent of fear. Everyone knew that these planes were not ornaments, but instruments of death. Every rivet, every polished gun mount would one day fly into skies filled with flak and fire. Some whispered that no machine could withstand such punishment, that America was sending young men into a storm with wings that might not hold. But each morning the workers returned, carrying their doubts alongside their drills. "If it can save just one crew, then it's worth it," a machinist in Wichita said. His words carried the quiet conviction of thousands. The B-17 itself grew into more than a machine. Its form was almost symbolic, a fortress not only of steel, but of the idea that America could absorb a blow and answer with something greater. Its defensive guns bristled like quills, a porcupine of the skies. Its long wings stretched outward, a reminder that America's reach would not be confined to its shores. To watch one roll out of the factory doors was to watch grief reborn as defiance. The sight of silver wings gleaming in the morning light became a ritual of hope, and with every new plane, the scale of America's transformation became clearer. Farmers plowed by day and worked second shifts by night. Housewives left kitchens for tool benches. African American workers, long excluded, pressed into plants under the double struggle of war and segregation, determined to prove their skill and patriotism. Native and immigrant, rich and poor, men and women, the lines blurred under the glow of welding sparks. The arsenal of democracy was not a slogan, but a lived reality written in sweat across millions of brows. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Japanese strategists believed they had time. Reports of American losses at Pearl Harbor fed their confidence. But while they celebrated, a machine far greater than they had imagined was awakening. In less than 2 years, the United States would outproduce every Axis power combined, its factories turning out planes at a rate that defied comprehension. One American senator quipped, "We are turning out planes faster than the enemy can shoot them down." It was not an exaggeration. Yet, in those early months, the outcome was far from assured. Pilots trained in Texas and Florida, climbing into the cockpits of new B-17s with both awe and apprehension. Some wrote home about the sheer size of the planes, how they felt like flying battleships. One young airman described his first takeoff. The runway trembled, the engines roared like thunder, and suddenly we were airborne, a fortress rising into the sky. The pride in his words masked the danger he knew awaited him. Every new bomber carried the weight of expectation, the prayers of families, the labor of thousands. It was not just aluminum and engines. It was a promise that America's skies would never again be caught unguarded. Each delivery to the Air Corps was greeted with solemnity. Workers often stood in silence as a plane rolled out, knowing it might not return. Some wept quietly, a strange mix of pride and grief, as if sending a child off to war. The factories themselves seemed alive, breathing in raw materials and exhaling bombers. Through it all, a subtle transformation took place, not only of steel, but of spirit. Americans who had felt powerless watching the devastation at Pearl Harbor now felt agency in every rivet, every bolt. By late 1942, the results were undeniable. Hundreds of B-17s now filled the skies over Europe, flying missions that tested their endurance and their crews' courage. Photographs of these bombers in formation, gleaming silver crosses against the clouds, were printed in newspapers back home. The Japanese, who had believed America crippled, could not see these images yet, but their day of reckoning was approaching. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a phrase. It was wings, engines, machine guns, and bombs. It was Rosie the Riveter flexing her arm and nameless workers tightening bolts through the night. The same hands that once milked cows or typed letters now bent steel to purpose. Still, questions lingered. Would these machines born in such haste truly endure the crucible of combat? Could any fortress of steel protect fragile flesh against the fury of flak and fighters? For now, though, the sight of fresh bombers taxiing across runways was enough to remind America that it was not broken. The giant that Japanese planners thought they had slain was stirring awake, its heartbeat pounding in the thunder of engines. And as the first waves of B-17s lifted into the sky, the world began to sense a new reality. America had found its wings again, and this time they were made of fortress steel. What no one yet knew was how high those wings would carry and how heavy the price would be to keep them aloft. The true test was yet to come, written in fire across the skies of Europe and the Pacific, where the flying fortress would either earn its name or be torn apart by the storm waiting ahead. The bomber stood on the tarmac like a living thing, its nose glinting in the morning sun, its belly heavy with steel. For the young men approaching it with duffel bags slung over their shoulders, the B-17 was more than an airplane. It was promise and peril bound together in rivets and aluminum. They ran their hands across its skin, a gesture that was half prayer, half superstition. They called it a fortress, yet every one of them knew that inside its thin walls their lives would hang by a thread. Pilots spoke of the first time they gripped its yoke as if recalling a baptism. The engines roared with the voice of thunder, pulling the ground away beneath them. The climb was steady, powerful, giving the sense that the machine could shoulder the sky itself. Yet behind that thrill lay a gnawing reality. Each ascent might end in fire. The fortress could endure punishment beyond imagination, but it was not invincible. Its wings could be torn by flak, its skin riddled with holes, its crew silenced in an instant. It was resilience embodied, but resilience always dances with fragility. Over Europe, the true nature of the fortress revealed itself. In 1942, when the first mission struck targets in occupied France, crews learned a bitter truth. Daylight raids meant visibility, and visibility meant slaughter. German fighters swarmed like hornets, their cannon shells tearing into bomber formations. Black puffs of flak blossomed around them, each one a dark flower blooming with shrapnel. The B-17s held their formation, disciplined and defiant, but the cost was staggering. A returning crewman wrote, "We left the coast 21 strong. We came back with 12. The sky swallowed the rest. The fortress was designed to fight back. 10 machine guns protruded from every angle, nose, tail, waist, top, and belly, so many that German pilots joked about attacking a flying porcupine. Gunners hunched in cramped bubbles, their eyes stinging from smoke, their fingers blistered from the heat of constant fire. And yet, the fortress showed a stubbornness that bordered on the miraculous. Stories spread of bombers limping home with tails shredded, wings torn open, and engines gone. Crews staggered from fuselages that looked like lacework, riddled with hundreds of holes. One pilot landed a fortress with half a wing missing. These crippled but unbroken machines circulated like scripture, proof that the fortress was more than aluminum. It was endurance given form. Still, that endurance carried a cost written in blood. Casualty rates soared. During the brutal autumn of 1943, a crewman's odds of surviving 25 missions were slim. In England, where the bombers were based, entire airfields felt like revolving doors of grief. New crews arrived bright-eyed, only to vanish into the smoke weeks later. Yet they flew, not from ignorance, but from conviction. Letters tucked into jackets carried phrases like, "If I don't come back, tell them I flew for something bigger." The fortress itself became a character in these stories, almost a comrade. Crews gave their planes names: Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, Knockout Dropper. They painted pin-up girls or cartoon mascots on their noses as if to personalize fate. They spoke of their planes as partners, whispering encouragement before takeoff. For the enemy, it was a nightmare. German civilians looked up to see formations of hundreds filling the sky, a rolling thunder that shook windows and hearts alike. Even Luftwaffe aces admitted a grudging respect. One pilot said to attack them was to fight against the sky itself. The Pacific smelled of salt and iron. When the Japanese pilots who had once exulted over Pearl Harbor returned home in 1941, they boasted of a crippled enemy. But by 1942 and 1943, whispers reached them that something vast was stirring. The flying fortress, once just a blueprint, was now shaping the course of two oceans. At Midway in June 1942, formations of B-17s rose from Hawaiian fields and flew into the teeth of history. They were there, hurling their weight against an enemy that had dared to call the Pacific its empire. For the young crews, the Pacific felt endless, a place where isolation itself was an enemy. A tail gunner wrote in his diary, "The ocean looked like it could swallow us whole, but the fortress felt like the only raft big enough to carry hope." What the Japanese had underestimated was not only the machine, but the will behind it. By the war's end, over 12,000 B-17s had been built. That number was not just arithmetic, it was a chorus. For every fortress that fell, another rose from an assembly line, carrying the labor of thousands. The symbolic transformation was undeniable. What began as broken wings at Pearl Harbor had become armies of wings filling the skies. Photographs captured formations of B-17s glinting in the sun, stretching from one horizon to the other. The fortress was no longer just an aircraft. It was proof that America had forged strength out of humiliation. Even the enemy felt the weight of that transformation. Japanese pilots, who once laughed at America's weakness, now described the formations as terrifying and endless. One survivor admitted, "We struck them once and believed them broken, but the sky itself became their weapon." As the war ground on, the skies filled not just with B-17s, but with a vision of what air power meant. Pearl Harbor had tried to break America's wings, but instead it had multiplied them. Where once oil fires blackened Hawaii, now contrails scribbled across Europe and the Pacific, white scars on a blue canvas. The final irony was that the B-17, for all its fame, was only one note in America's industrial symphony. Other bombers would follow, the sleek B-24, the colossal B-29. But the fortress remained the symbol, the first true answer to the arrogance of Pearl Harbor. When peace finally came, the fortresses did not linger. Many were scrapped, their aluminum melted down. Yet in memory they endured, in photographs, in museums, in the words of those who flew them. They were metaphors of resilience, proof that destruction could be answered with creation. Looking back, the arc was stark. From the smoke of Pearl Harbor to silver skies filled with fortresses, America's journey was one of transformation. The Japanese had thought they had broken wings, but those wings multiplied into armies, casting shadows long enough to alter history. As one veteran said years later, his voice cracked with memory, "We were kids, but up there we were giants, because the fortress made us so." His words carried the echo of a truth larger than any single mission, that in the end, it was not the machines alone, but the spirit inside them that defined victory.